Some people wear their badges on their chest. Detective Sarah Mitchell wore hers in her heart, hidden beneath layers of secrets that even her closest friends couldn't see. On a rainy Tuesday evening in September, when strangers rushed to help what they thought was a woman going into labor outside a downtown warehouse, they had no idea they were witnessing the final act of a 3-year undercover operation. They couldn't know that her gasps weren't from contractions but from the knife wound bleeding through her jacket. They couldn't see the Nightshade badge, the invisible mark of the city's most dangerous undercover unit, that separated her from every other pregnant woman in that moment. What they thought was the beginning of life was actually a dance with death. And the real story was far more complicated than anyone standing on that rain-soaked street could have imagined. Sarah Mitchell had learned to lie before she learned to drive. Not the small, harmless lies that children tell to avoid punishment, but the kind of lies that become a second skin. The kind that you wear so long you sometimes forget where the lie ends and the truth begins. At 32 years old, she had spent the last 3 years living as someone else entirely. The morning everything changed, started like any other Tuesday in her fake life. She woke up in the small apartment on Riverside Avenue, the one that smelled like old carpet and had a leak in the bathroom that the landlord never fixed. The apartment wasn't really hers. Nothing in her life was really hers anymore. The furniture came from the police department's storage unit. The photos on the wall showed people she'd never met, carefully chosen to build a backstory that could withstand scrutiny. Even the name on the mailbox was borrowed. Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her hand resting on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant. That part at least was real. The baby growing inside her was the only authentic thing in her entire existence, and the irony wasn't lost on her. She had become pregnant 4 months into her undercover assignment, a complication that her superiors at the police department had debated for weeks. Some wanted to pull her out immediately. Others saw an opportunity. A pregnant woman was invisible in certain ways, beyond suspicion, easily underestimated. Detective Marcus Webb, her handler, had made the final call. "You can do this," he'd told her during a secret meeting in a parking garage downtown. "They'll never suspect a pregnant woman. But Sarah, if things get dangerous, we pull you out. No questions asked." That was 7 months ago. Things had gotten dangerous long before this morning. She splashed cold water on her face and studied her reflection. The woman staring back at her had bleached blonde hair, a detail she maintained every 3 weeks in a salon where she never spoke about her life. Her real hair was dark brown, currently hidden under layers of chemical processing. She had put on weight beyond the pregnancy, intentionally changing her silhouette. Even the way she walked was different now, a slower, more cautious gait that matched her cover story as a struggling single mother trying to make ends meet. The cover identity had a name: Lisa Parker. Lisa worked part-time at a convenience store 2 blocks away and lived paycheck to paycheck. Lisa had a boyfriend named Jake, who came and went, usually showing up with money, but never staying long. Jake was part of the operation too, another undercover officer who played his role perfectly. In the world they had created, Jake was a small-time dealer, just significant enough to be interesting but not important enough to attract serious attention. The target of their operation was much bigger. Vincent Reese ran the largest drug distribution network in the city from behind the legitimate facade of an import-export business. For years, law enforcement had tried to build a case against him, but Reese was careful. He insulated himself with layers of subordinates and front companies. Money flowed through so many channels that tracking it became impossible. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Reese seemed untouchable. Until Sarah had managed to get close to his organization. It started with Jake. Her fake boyfriend had made contact with one of Reese's street-level dealers, establishing credibility over months of small transactions. Jake's carefully constructed reputation as a reliable buyer eventually led to an introduction to Marcus Chen, one of Reese's mid-level distributors. And Marcus Chen, it turned out, had a weakness for pregnant women who reminded him of his sister. Sarah had played the part perfectly. She was vulnerable but not weak, struggling but not desperate enough to attract suspicion. She asked careful questions that seemed innocent, remembered details that built trust, and slowly became a familiar face in places where Reese's people operated. They started to talk around her as if she wasn't there. They made phone calls in her presence, held meetings in the same restaurants where she waited tables during her brief stint at a diner they frequented. Information flowed slowly at first, Then faster. Sarah memorized everything. Locations, names, times, patterns. She couldn't write anything down or risk recording conversations. Everything went into her memory, carefully compartmentalized so she could recall it during her secret meetings with Marcus Webb. The warehouse district on the east side of downtown became familiar territory. This was where much of Reese's operation centered. A maze of old buildings that had once been manufacturing plants, now repurposed into storage facilities, automotive shops and businesses that existed only on paper. Sarah had identified at least 4 locations that served as distribution points. She knew the schedule of deliveries, had memorized license plate numbers, and had even caught glimpses of the accounting books during a meeting where she'd brought coffee to Marcus Chen and his associates. She was close, so close to having enough information to bring down the entire network. But 3 days ago, something had shifted. Marcus Chen had looked at her differently during their last encounter, his friendly demeanor replaced with something colder. When she'd asked if everything was okay, he'd smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Everything's fine, Lisa. Just fine." The way he said her fake name sent warning signals through her body. She'd reported the interaction to Marcus Webb immediately during a brief phone call from a gas station bathroom. Webb had told her to be careful, but to keep going. They were too close to stop now. This morning, she received a text message from an unknown number, just an address and a time. The warehouse on Keller Street. 7 p.m. Sarah knew this warehouse. It was one of the locations she'd identified as a distribution point, but she'd never been inside. She'd only observed it from a distance, watching trucks come and go, noting patterns and vehicle descriptions. An invitation to go inside was either a breakthrough or a trap. She called Marcus Webb from the burner phone she kept hidden in a box of tampons under her bathroom sink. "I got a text," she said when he answered. "They want me at the Keller Street warehouse tonight." Webb was quiet for a moment. She could hear papers rustling in the background, could picture him in his small office at police headquarters, surrounded by files and surveillance photos. "That's a new development," he finally said. "Did they say why?" "No details, just the address and time." "Could be they're moving you up. Chen might be bringing you closer to the inner circle." Webb paused again. "Or it could be a problem. Your instincts telling you anything?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to analyze the feeling in her gut. Fear. Yes, but that was always present now. Something else too, though. A wrongness that she couldn't quite name. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something felt off with Chen last time I saw him. You go to the meeting, but we'll have a team on standby 2 blocks away. You'll wear a wire. If anything feels wrong, you say the code phrase and we come in immediately. What if they search me? What if they find the wire? Then you're a concerned citizen who recorded a conversation because you were scared. You play dumb, play pregnant, play vulnerable." "But Sarah," his voice softened, "if your gut is screaming at you, we don't do this. We can pull you out right now." "The information we have might be enough." Sarah looked down at her belly, felt the baby kick against her palm. She thought about all the lives Reese's drugs had destroyed, all the families torn apart by addiction. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent building this identity, living this lie. "I can do this," she said. "One more night." She went through the motions of being Lisa Parker, working a 4-hour shift at the convenience store where her boss, a tired man named Ray, barely looked up from his newspaper. She sold lottery tickets and cigarettes and overpriced bottles of water. She smiled at customers and made small talk about the weather. All the while, her mind was running through scenarios, preparing for every possibility. At 6 o'clock, she left the store and walked back to her apartment. The wire technician was waiting in a service van parked around the corner, posing as a cable company employee. She met him in the alley behind her building, and he fitted her with the smallest recording device they had, carefully taping it beneath her maternity shirt where the swell of her belly would hide any unusual shapes. "It's voice-activated," the technician explained, a young officer named David who looked barely old enough to be out of the academy. "Battery life is about 6 hours, more than enough for your meeting. The range is good up to about half a mile with these buildings, but we'll have the relay van parked as close as we safely can." The baby was active today, rolling and kicking as if sensing her anxiety. "What if they have a signal jammer?" David frowned. "That's possible, but unlikely. Most of these operations don't expect to be recorded, so they don't take those kinds of precautions. If you lose signal, the device still records locally. We'll get the audio even if we can't hear it live." That thought wasn't as comforting as he probably intended it to be. At 6:45, Sarah walked to her car, an old Honda Civic that had seen better days. It fit Lisa Parker's story perfectly. Dented, slightly rusty, with a check engine light that had been on for months. She drove through the early evening traffic, heading toward the warehouse district as the sun began its descent behind the city skyline. The Keller Street warehouse looked abandoned from the outside. Graffiti covered the lower portions of the brick walls, and several windows on the second floor were broken. But Sarah knew better. She'd watched this place long enough to know that appearances were deceiving. The business inside was very much alive. She parked across the street, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. Through her windshield, she could see a metal door on the side of the building, closed but not padlocked. A security camera pointed at the entrance, its red light blinking steadily. Sarah took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and touched her belly. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to the baby. "I promise." She got out of the car, locked it, and walked across the street. The evening air was thick with humidity, and dark clouds were gathering overhead. Rain was coming. She could smell it in the air, that particular scent of ozone that preceded a storm. As she approached the metal door, it opened before she could knock. Marcus Chen stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Lisa," he said. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. "What's this about? Come inside. Someone wants to meet you." Screamed at her to run. Something was wrong. The way Chen held himself, the careful neutrality of his voice, the fact that he hadn't invited her to any social pleasantries, it all added up to danger. But she had come this far. She had lived this life for 3 years. She couldn't back out now without a concrete reason. She followed Chen into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit, illuminated by industrial lights hanging from the high ceiling. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, a cavernous area filled with wooden crates and metal shelving units. The smell of motor oil and dust hung in the air. Sarah could hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building, male voices engaged in conversation she couldn't quite make out. Chen led her through the main floor, past crates marked with shipping labels from overseas, toward a small office area built into one corner of the warehouse. As they walked, Sarah catalogued everything she saw, her trained eye picking up details that might be important later. Security cameras in the corners, exit signs marking at least 3 different doors, a forklift parked near a loading bay, pallets of merchandise covered with tarps. "Wait here," Chen said when they reached the office. He disappeared inside, closing the door behind him. Sarah stood alone in the warehouse, her heart pounding. The wire beneath her shirt suddenly felt obvious, a foreign presence that surely everyone could see. She resisted the urge to touch it, to adjust it, knowing that any unusual movement might give her away. The office door opened. Chen stepped out, followed by a man Sarah had only seen in surveillance photos, Vincent Reese himself. He was older than she'd expected, probably in his late 50s, with grey hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the industrial setting. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, the eyes of someone who had survived in a dangerous business by being smarter than everyone around him. "Lisa Parker," Reese said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I've heard interesting things about you." Sarah felt the fear sharpen her throat but forced herself to stay calm, to stay in character. "I hope they're good things," she said, attempting a nervous laugh that wasn't entirely fake. Reese smiled. But like Chen smiled days before, it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends on your perspective. Marcus tells me you've been asking questions, showing interest in our operations, taking in information." "I'm just trying to help Jake," Sarah said, using her cover story. "He said working with you guys could lead to better opportunities. I want to support him, especially with the baby coming." "Of course," Reese said. He walked closer, his eyes moving from her face to her belly and back again. "A child changes everything, makes you think about the future differently, makes you want security, stability." "Exactly," Sarah agreed, relieved that he seemed to be accepting her explanation. "It also makes you vulnerable," Reese continued. "Makes you do things you might not otherwise do, take risks, make sacrifices." The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Reese reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He held it up for her to see. The photo showed Sarah, the real Sarah, with dark hair and a police uniform, standing outside the precinct headquarters. It was old, probably from a department event years ago, but unmistakable. The thing about lies, Reese said quietly, is that they always fall apart eventually. We've known for 2 weeks, Detective Mitchell. Did you really think we wouldn't check? The world tilted. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, through exit strategies, through everything she'd been trained to do in a blown cover situation. Her hand moved instinctively toward her belly, a protective gesture that was both maternal and tactical. The wire was recording everything. I need you to say the code phrase, Marcus Webb's voice echoed in her memory. If anything feels wrong, you say the code phrase and we come in immediately. But before Sarah could speak, before she could trigger the rescue operation that was supposed to be 2 blocks away, Chen moved behind her. She felt something sharp against her lower back, pressure that could only be a knife. Please don't scream, Chen said, his voice apologetic. Let's keep this civilized. Reese stepped closer, close enough that she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Detective. You're going to tell us exactly what you've reported to your department. You're going to give us names of everyone involved in your operation. And you're going to do it quickly because I have a plane to catch in 3 hours. Sarah's training kicked in, overriding the panic. Stay calm. Keep talking. Buy time. The wire was still recording. Webb's team would be listening. She just needed to hold on long enough for backup to arrive. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If you hurt me, there's no coming back from that. Right now, you've got charges you can beat. You've got lawyers who can find loopholes, but if something happens to a pregnant police officer, there's no lawyer in the world who can save you. Reese's expression didn't change. That would be true if anyone knew you were here. But you're Lisa Parker tonight, aren't you? A struggling single mother who came to a warehouse in a bad part of town. These things happen. People disappear, especially people who aren't who they claim to be. The knife pressed harder against Sarah's back. She felt the tip pierce through her jacket, through her shirt, touching skin. Not deep enough to be a serious wound yet, but enough to draw blood, enough to make the threat absolutely real. Last chance, Reese said. Talk, and maybe you and your baby walk out of here. Stay quiet and we'll have a very different conversation. Sarah's mind was working frantically. Webb would have heard everything by now. Backup would be coming. She just needed to stay alive long enough for them to arrive. But how long would that take? 3 minutes? 5? Could she hold on that long? The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the danger they were in. The movement was so sudden, so forceful, that Sarah gasped. And that's when everything went wrong. Chen's grip loosened slightly when Sarah gasped, instinctive human concern breaking through his professional detachment for just a second. That second was all she needed. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours in tactical training before joining the undercover unit. Her instructors had drilled into her that pregnant women weren't helpless, that her condition didn't make her a victim unless she chose to act like one. In that moment, with the knife against her back and Reese standing close enough to grab, every lesson came flooding back. She twisted hard to the left, dropping low as she moved. The knife sliced through her jacket more deeply, cutting into the flesh of her lower back, but her momentum carried her away from Chen's center of control. Pain exploded across her back, sharp and hot. But she didn't stop moving. She brought her elbow up and back, connecting with Chen's jaw with enough force to snap his head sideways. Reese lunged forward, reaching for her arm, but Sarah was already pivoting toward the warehouse floor. She grabbed a metal pipe leaning against the wall, the kind used for industrial shelving, and swung it in a wide arc. The pipe connected with Reese's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a curse. "Officer down!" Sarah screamed, knowing the wire would pick it up, knowing Webb would hear. "Keller Street Warehouse! Officer down!" Chen recovered faster than she'd hoped. He came at her again, the knife still in his hand, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Sarah backed away, putting one of the wooden crates between them, buying precious seconds. She could feel blood soaking into the waistband of her pants, warm and sticky. The pain was getting worse, but adrenaline kept her moving. Voices erupted from deeper in the warehouse. Other members of Reese's crew, drawn by the commotion. Sarah could see shadows moving, figures running toward the confrontation. She was outnumbered, injured, and running out of time. The main entrance burst open with a crash of metal. 3 police officers poured through, weapons drawn, shouting commands. But they weren't close enough. The office area where Sarah was trapped sat at least 50 feet from the entrance, with pallets and crates providing cover for anyone who wanted to make this into a firefight. And that's exactly what happened. One of Reese's men, a thick-shouldered enforcer Sarah had seen but never been introduced to, pulled a gun and fired toward the entrance. The shot echoed through the warehouse, impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The police officers scattered, taking cover behind machinery and crates, returning fire. Sarah dropped to the ground, crawling behind a stack of pallets as bullets tore through the air above her. Her back screamed in protest at every movement, and she could feel the wetness spreading down her leg now. The cut was worse than she'd thought, maybe much worse. Reese was shouting orders, his cultured voice stripped away to reveal something harder underneath. Jars? Get the trucks out the back, burn everything in the office. Move. Chen appeared above her, the knife still in his hand, his jaw already swelling from where she'd hit him. But the rage in his eyes had been replaced with something else. Calculation. He grabbed her arm, pulling her up roughly. You're my way out of here, he said, pressing the knife against her throat. You're going to walk me out of this building. Sarah's training told her never to let yourself be taken to a second location, never to become a hostage. But with the knife at her throat and gunfire continuing around them, her options had narrowed to almost nothing. She let Chen pull her to her feet, felt him position himself behind her, using her pregnant body as a shield. Hold your fire! Chen screamed toward the police officers. I've got your cop! I've got the pregnant cop! An eerie silence fell over the warehouse, broken only by the sound of rain that had started pounding on the metal roof. Through the windows high above, Sarah could see lightning flash, illuminating the scene in brief, stark moments of clarity. Marcus Webb's voice cut through the silence, amplified by a megaphone from outside. Let her go, Chen. There's no way out of this that ends well for you. There's a back exit, Chen hissed in Sarah's ear. You're going to walk me there, nice and slow. If anyone follows, if anyone takes a shot, this knife goes through your neck. Understand? Sarah nodded slightly, enough to acknowledge but not enough to press against the blade. Her mind was racing through scenarios. Chen was panicking, making desperate moves. Desperate people made mistakes. She just had to stay alive long enough to exploit one of those mistakes. They moved slowly through the warehouse, Chen keeping her body between himself and the police officers who tracked their movement from behind cover. Sarah could see faces she recognized now. Webb was somewhere outside, but officers Rodriguez and Chen were visible near the main entrance, their weapons trained but not firing. They looked young and scared, not much older than David the tech who had fitted her wire hours ago. The journey across the warehouse floor felt endless. Every step sent fresh pain shooting through her back. The baby was moving frantically now, responding to her stress hormones, kicking and squirming as if trying to find safety that didn't exist. Sarah found herself talking to the child silently, promising things she wasn't sure she could deliver. We're going to be okay. I'm going to get us out of this. You're going to be born and grow up and never know how close we came to not making it. The back exit loomed ahead, a heavy door that opened onto the alley behind the warehouse. Chen had a hand on the push bar when the door suddenly swung inward. A SWAT officer in full tactical gear filled the doorway, weapon raised. Drop the knife! Everything happened too fast and too slow at the same time. Chen jerked Sarah backward, pulling her away from the door. The movement caused the knife to slice across her throat. Not deep, but enough to draw blood, enough to make her gasp. The SWAT officer hesitated, his training warring with his humanity, unwilling to take a shot that might hit the pregnant woman. Chen was backing up now, pulling Sarah with him, trying to get back to the cover of the warehouse interior. But in his panic, he wasn't watching where he was going. His heel caught on something, maybe a pipe, maybe just an uneven spot in the concrete floor. He stumbled, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. Sarah drove her head backward, connecting with Chen's face. She felt his nose crunch against the back of her skull, heard his howl of pain. The knife fell away from her throat as his hands flew to his broken nose. She twisted free, dropping to her knees as the SWAT team poured through the back entrance. Chen didn't run. He couldn't really. There was nowhere to go. Blood streaming from his nose, he raised his hands in surrender as 3 SWAT officers surrounded him, weapons trained on his center mass. Within seconds, he was face down on the concrete, being handcuffed, no longer a threat. Sarah tried to stand, but found her legs wouldn't cooperate. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving behind the full realization of her injuries. She touched her back, feeling the blood that soaked through her clothes. When she brought her hand forward, her palm was dark red. "Officer down!" someone shouted. "We need medical." "Officer Mitchell is injured." Hands helped her lie down on the cold concrete. A female SWAT officer knelt beside her, pressing something against the wound on her back. "Stay with me, Sarah. Paramedics are coming." "You're going to be okay." "The baby," Sarah managed to say. "Is the baby okay?" "We're going to take care of both of you," the officer promised. "What's your pain level?" 8, Sarah said, though truthfully it felt closer to 10, maybe 9. Through the chaos of police securing the warehouse and officers shouting updates, Sarah heard Webb's voice. He appeared above her, his face pale with worry. "Damn it, Sarah. I told you if things got dangerous, we'd pull you out." "You did pull me out," she said, attempting a weak smile. "Just with slightly worse timing than I would have preferred." "Don't joke. You're bleeding pretty badly." "Tell me something I don't know." Paramedics arrived, their professional calm a stark contrast to the controlled chaos around them. They moved her carefully onto a backboard, securing her neck and spine even though she insisted she could move everything. "Protocol," they explained. "Better safe than sorry." As they loaded her into the ambulance, Sarah caught a glimpse of Vincent Reese being led out of the warehouse in handcuffs. His expensive suit was dirty, his carefully maintained composure shattered. When their eyes met, Sarah saw something that might have been respect mixed with hatred. The ambulance doors closed, blocking out the scene. The female paramedic, her name tag said Johnson, was taking Sarah's vital signs while her partner radioed ahead to the hospital. "Blood pressure is dropping," Johnson said, her voice tight with professional concern. "We need to move fast. Step on it, Mike." The ambulance lurched forward, sirens wailing. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to focus on staying conscious. The pain was getting worse, spreading from her back through her entire body. She felt cold despite the warmth of the ambulance interior. "Stay with me, Detective," Johnson said, gripping her hand. "Tell me about your baby, boy or girl." "Don't know yet," Sarah whispered. "Wanted to be surprised." "What kind of surprise did you want? Were you hoping for one or the other?" Sarah understood what Johnson was doing. Keeping her talking, keeping her conscious. She played along. "Doesn't matter. Just one healthy. Just one." Her voice trailed off. The world was getting dim around the edges, darkness creeping in from the periphery of her vision. She heard Johnson shouting something, felt hands pressing harder against her back, sensed urgency that hadn't been there before. The baby kicked. Once, twice, 3 times. Strong movements that somehow felt like reassurance. "We're still here, Mama. We're still fighting." "That's right," Sarah murmured. "We're still fighting." The ambulance screamed through red lights, weaving through traffic, racing toward Mercy General Hospital. In the back, Johnson was working frantically, starting a second IV line, calling out updates to the hospital that grew more urgent with each passing moment. When they burst through the emergency room doors, a trauma team was waiting. Sarah caught fragmented impressions, bright lights, people in scrubs, voices giving orders in medical terminology she didn't fully understand. They transferred her from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed with practiced efficiency. "Knife wound to the lower back, possible internal bleeding," someone was saying. "Patient is 7 months pregnant. Fetal heartbeat is strong, but mother's vitals are declining." "Get her to OR2, another voice commanded. "We need to stabilize her and assess the damage. Page obstetrics immediately." Sarah tried to speak, tried to ask questions, but the words wouldn't come. Someone was putting a mask over her face, telling her to breathe deeply, explaining that they were going to help her, but she needed to let them put her to sleep for a little while. She wanted to argue, wanted to stay conscious, wanted to make sure they understood that the baby was the priority, but the medication was already taking effect, pulling her down into darkness. The last conscious thought was of the child she hadn't yet met. The life she'd been protecting even as she'd put herself in danger. "Please," she thought, as the darkness claimed her. "Please let this baby be okay." The operating room was cold. Or maybe it was just her. Sarah couldn't tell anymore. She surfaced occasionally from the anesthesia, brief moments of confused awareness. She heard voices discussing surgical options, felt hands moving her body, sensed urgency in every action. But the details slipped away before she could grasp them. Like trying to hold water in her hands. Time became meaningless. Minutes or hours could have passed. She had no way to know. When true consciousness finally returned, it came slowly, reluctantly. Sarah became aware of sounds first, The steady beep of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, distant voices in a hallway, then sensation, something soft beneath her, blankets covering her body, an ache in her back that was dull but still present. Finally, she managed to open her eyes. The recovery room was dim, lit only by the glow of medical equipment. An IV drip fed into her arm. Wires connected her to various monitors. Through the window in the door, she could see nurses moving past in the hallway outside. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The swell was still there. Relief washed over her so powerfully that tears sprang to her eyes. "The baby's fine," a voice said from beside the bed. Webb sat in a plastic chair, looking exhausted. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over the chair back, and his eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. They monitored the heartbeat through the whole surgery, strong and steady the entire time. "How long have I been out?" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. 6 hours. They had to do some repair work on your kidney. The knife did more damage than we initially thought. Webb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Sarah, you almost died." The surgeon said another few minutes without treatment and he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Reese?" Sarah asked. "In custody. Chen, too. We got most of his crew, seized the warehouse, impounded 3 trucks full of product." Webb managed a tired smile. "Your wire recorded. Even after you went down, it kept recording. We have Reese on tape admitting to the entire operation, threatening a police officer, ordering evidence destruction. The DA says it's the strongest case they've had in years." Sarah closed her eyes, letting the information wash over her. 3 years of lying, of living as someone else, of putting herself in danger. It had paid off. The case they'd built was solid. Reese would go to prison, his network would be dismantled, and the city would be safer for it. But the cost had been high. She touched her belly again, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. The cost had almost been everything. "There's something else," Webb said, his voice careful. "The department wants to give you a medal." "The chief is calling you a hero. Media's already got hold of the story. Pregnant detective takes down drug lord." "You're about to become very famous." Sarah felt a surge of discomfort that had nothing to do with her injuries. "I don't want to be famous. I just want to go back to my life," Webb asked quietly. Sarah Mitchell the detective, or Lisa Parker the undercover operative? It was a good question. Sarah had been Lisa Parker for so long that parts of that identity had become comfortable, familiar. She knew Lisa's apartment better than her own real home. She could recite Lisa's backstory without thinking. She had lived that life so completely that reality had become strange. Sarah spent 5 more days in the hospital. They moved her from the recovery room to a regular patient room on the 3rd floor, one with a window that overlooked the parking lot and a television mounted on the wall that she rarely turned on. Nurses came in every few hours to check her vitals, adjust her medications, and ensure the baby was still thriving despite the trauma her body had endured. The wound on her back healed slowly. The doctors had been forced to make a larger incision during surgery to reach the damaged kidney, so now she carried a scar that would always remind her of that night. The cut on her throat was superficial, barely needing stitches, but it left a thin red line that would fade with time but never completely disappear. Visitors came and went. Webb stopped by daily, bringing updates on the case and occasionally smuggling in real coffee when the nurses weren't looking. Other officers from the undercover unit visited, people she'd worked with over the years who understood what she'd been through in ways that outsiders couldn't. They brought flowers and magazines and told stories about their own close calls, their own moments of terror disguised as camaraderie. Jake, the real Jake, Officer Jake Torres, who had played her boyfriend in the operation, came on the 3rd day. He brought a stuffed elephant for the baby and stood awkwardly at the foot of her bed, clearly uncomfortable with the hospital setting. "I should have been there with you," he said. "At the warehouse. I should have insisted on being part of the meeting." "You were where you needed to be," Sarah told him. "Following the trucks that left through the back exit. You got 3 arrests out of that tale." "Don't beat yourself up." But she could see the guilt in his eyes, the what-ifs that would probably haunt him for months. In the undercover world, you protected your partners. The fact that she'd been alone when things went bad violated an unspoken code, even though logically everyone knew she'd made the choice to go alone. The hardest visitor came on the 4th day. Her mother flew in from Seattle, a small woman with Sarah's eyes and hair that had gone silver years ago. She took one look at her daughter in the hospital bed and burst into tears, not speaking for several minutes while she held Sarah's hand and cried. When she finally found her voice, she said, "You didn't tell me how dangerous this job was. You said it was desk work, surveillance, nothing risky." "I know, Mom." "I'm sorry. A grandchild shouldn't find out about their mother's work by seeing it on the news. That's not how this should have gone." Her mother wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "What were you thinking? 7 months pregnant, and you go into a building with criminals?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question. The easy answer was that she'd been doing her job. The more complicated answer was that somewhere along the way, the job had become more than just a job. It had become her identity, her purpose, the thing that defined her, and maybe she'd lost perspective. Maybe she'd started to believe she was invincible. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Sarah said quietly. "I thought I could handle it. But at what cost?" Her mother's voice broke again. "You almost died. That baby almost died. All to catch criminals who will probably find ways to get out of prison eventually anyway." It was a viewpoint Sarah couldn't entirely argue against. In her mother's world, a world of teaching elementary school and tending gardens and playing bridge with friends, the risks Sarah took made no sense. The idea of deliberately putting yourself in danger was foreign, almost incomprehensible. They talked for another hour, carefully avoiding the deeper questions neither of them was ready to answer. When her mother left, promising to come back the next day, Sarah felt more exhausted than after any interrogation or stakeout she'd ever endured. That evening, as the sun set beyond the parking lot and painted her room in shades of orange and gold, Sarah finally allowed herself to truly think about what came next. The department would want her back eventually, though probably not in undercover work. A pregnant officer who'd been stabbed on duty would be reassigned to something safer, something that wouldn't generate headlines or liability concerns. But did she even want to go back? The question surprised her. She'd been a police officer since she was 23 years old. It was all she knew, all she'd ever wanted to do. Her father had been a cop, killed in the line of duty when she was 16. Following in his footsteps had felt like honoring his memory, like completing something he'd started. Now, though, with a child on the way and scars that would never fully heal, the certainty she'd always felt about her career had developed cracks. The sixth day brought a different kind of visitor, a woman in her early 50s, professionally dressed with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She introduced herself as Dr. Barr, Patricia Saunders, the department psychologist assigned to officers who'd experienced trauma. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions today, Dr. Ryman," Saunders said after they'd talked for a while. "But I want you to think about something. The badge you carry, whether it's the visible one on your uniform or the invisible one you wore undercover, doesn't define your worth as a person. You can take it off. You can choose a different path. And that doesn't make you a failure or a quitter." "My father died wearing that badge," Sarah said. "I read your file." Dr. Saunders paused, choosing her words carefully. "But your father would probably want you to make choices based on what's best for you and your child, not based on what you think would honor him. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't continuing down a dangerous path. Sometimes it's choosing to step away." The words stayed with Sarah after Dr. Saunders left. That night, alone in her hospital room with only the soft beeping of monitors for company, she finally let herself cry. Not the quiet tears she'd shed when her mother visited, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal. She cried for the life she'd lost living as Lisa Parker. She cried for the danger she'd put her unborn child through. She cried for the father she'd never stopped missing and the career she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted anymore. When the storm of emotion finally passed, she felt strangely lighter, empty but clean, like a house after a thorough cleaning where all the hidden dirt has been swept away. The next morning, they discharged her. Webb came to drive her home, not to the apartment on Riverside Avenue where Lisa Parker had lived, but to her real home, a condo in a better neighborhood that she hadn't seen in 3 years except for brief, clandestine visits to pick up mail and check that everything was okay. The place felt foreign. She walked through rooms that should have been familiar but weren't, touching furniture she'd bought but barely remembered, looking at photographs of a woman who felt like a stranger. This was supposed to be her real life, but it felt less authentic than the fake life she'd constructed. Sarah spent the first week of her medical leave sleeping and healing and trying to readjust to reality. Friends from before her undercover assignment called, people she hadn't spoken to in years, wanting to check on her and congratulate her and hear the story firsthand. She kept the conversations brief, exhausted by the effort of explaining what had happened. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her building, trying to get interviews. News articles called her a hero, running photos of her being wheeled out of the warehouse on a stretcher. Social media exploded with debates about pregnant women in law enforcement, about undercover work, about whether she'd been brave or reckless. Sarah ignored most of it. She had more immediate concerns, like the fact that her baby was due in 2 months and she hadn't prepared anything. No nursery, no baby clothes, no plan for how single parenthood would work alongside a career in law enforcement. The father was never part of the equation. He'd been a brief relationship years ago, before the undercover assignment, someone who'd moved across the country for a job and gradually faded from her life. She'd informed him about the pregnancy and he'd sent money and good wishes but made it clear he had no interest in being a parent. That was fine. Sarah had always been independent, always handled things alone, except now, sitting in her condo, with her healing body and uncertain future, she felt desperately lonely. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Sarah received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter, but something made her pick up. Detective Mitchell. This is Amanda Reese. The name didn't register immediately. Then Sarah made the connection. Vincent Reese's daughter? Yes. The voice on the other end was young, maybe early 20s. I'm sorry to bother you. I got your number from, it doesn't matter how. I just needed to talk to you. Sarah's instinct was to hang up. Nothing good could come from this conversation, but curiosity won out. What do you want? I wanted to say, I'm sorry, for what my father did. For what happened to you. Amanda's voice wavered. I didn't know. About his business, about any of it. I thought he ran a legitimate import company. I thought, you don't need to apologize for your father's choices, Sarah said, though the words felt strange in her mouth.
But I do, because part of me is relieved.
Is that terrible? Amanda laughed, a sound without humor. I'm relieved he's in prison, relieved the lies are over. Does that make me a bad daughter? Sarah found herself saying, it makes you human. They talked for 20 minutes, two women on opposite sides of a criminal case, finding unexpected common ground. When they hung up, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 3 years seeing Vincent Reese as a monster, as an enemy to be defeated. The reminder that he was also a person with a daughter who loved him complicated the simple narrative she'd built. The clarity she thought she'd gained in the hospital started to dissolve into something more ambiguous. 2 days before her scheduled meeting with the department to discuss her future, Sarah went into early labor. Not the fake labor that strangers had mistaken her distress for outside the warehouse, but the real thing. Contractions that started mild and grew progressively stronger. The unmistakable signal that her body had decided it was time. Webb drove her to the hospital, running red lights and making jokes to cover his nervousness. I've been in shootouts, he said, white-knuckling the steering wheel. I've jumped out of moving vehicles. But this is terrifying. Sarah would have laughed if a contraction hadn't chosen that moment to hit. Labor lasted 14 hours, long, exhausting hours filled with pain that made her knife wound seem minor by comparison. Her mother was there, and Webb stayed in the waiting room, and nurses came and went with encouraging words and medical updates. When her son finally arrived, small and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Sarah felt something click into place. The uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks vanished. Looking at this tiny human who depended on her completely, she knew with absolute clarity what came next. She held her son against her chest, feeling his heartbeat synchronize with hers, and made a decision. 1 week later, Sarah walked into the police station for the first time since the warehouse incident. She'd called ahead, requested a meeting with Chief Rodriguez and Webb. They sat in the chief's office, surrounded by commendations and photographs of past officers, and Sarah said the words she'd been practicing. I'm resigning from the force. The chief's expression didn't change. Webb's did, surprise and something like dismay crossing his face. Sarah, you don't have to decide this now. You've been through trauma. Take more time. I've taken enough time. This isn't a snap decision. Sarah looked down at her hands, choosing her words carefully. I love this job. I'm good at this job. But I can't be the mother my son deserves. and be the kind of officer I'd want to be. Something has to give, and it can't be him. You could take a desk assignment, the chief suggested. Work regular hours, no undercover, no dangerous situations. That's not who I am. If I'm going to be a cop, I need to be all in, and I can't be all in anymore. Sarah looked up, meeting their eyes. My father died for this badge. I almost died for it. But my son deserves a mother who comes home every night, who's there for school plays and birthday parties and homework help. I can't give him that if I'm chasing criminals. Webb leaned back in his chair, his expression complicated. You're one of the best undercover operatives I've ever worked with. This is a loss for the department, but a gain for my son. After the meeting, Webb walked her out to the parking lot. They stood by her car in the afternoon sunshine, neither quite ready to say goodbye. What will you do? He asked. I don't know yet. Figure out this parenting thing first. Maybe go back to school. Maybe find work in private security or consulting. Sarah smiled. I've spent 3 years being someone else. Maybe it's time to figure out who Sarah Mitchell really is. You'll be bored within a month, Webb predicted. Maybe, but that's a problem for future me. They hugged, brief but genuine. As Sarah drove away from the station, she looked in her rearview mirror at the building that had been her professional home for nearly a decade. She felt no regret, only a sense of rightness about the choice she'd made. At home, a mother was watching the baby, who was asleep in the bassinet Sarah had finally set up in her bedroom. Her mother looked up when she entered, reading the answer in her face before Sarah spoke. You resigned.
I did.
Her mother's relief was visible. Good. I'm proud of you. Those words, simple as they were, meant more than any commendation or medal ever could. That night, Sarah sat in the rocking chair next to the bassinet, watching her son sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath. His perfect fingers curled into loose fists. The Nightshade badge, that invisible mark of the undercover unit, would always be part of her history. The scars on her back and throat would always remind her of how close she'd come to losing everything. But she'd survived. They'd both survived. And now they had a chance to build something new. Something that didn't involve lies or danger or pretending to be someone else. Sarah touched the thin scar on her throat, then looked at her son. You know what? She whispered. I think we're going to be okay. More than okay. We're going to be happy. The baby stirred in his sleep, making a small sound that might have been agreement. Sarah smiled, feeling more at peace than she had in years. Outside her window, the city continued its endless rhythm. Crimes were being committed. Officers were responding to calls. The work she'd done for so long went on without her, but for the first time in her adult life, Sarah Mitchell wasn't part of that world. She was here, in this quiet room with this perfect child, and that was exactly where she wanted to be. The years would bring challenges. Single parenthood always did. There would be moments when she missed the adrenaline, the sense of purpose, the feeling of making a difference. There would be days when she questioned her decision. But there would also be first words and first steps and first days of school. There would be bedtime stories and scraped knees and questions about everything. There would be a life built not on lies and danger, but on authenticity and love. Vincent Reese went to prison for 25 years. Marcus Chen cut a deal and testified against the remaining members of the organization, earning himself a reduced sentence. The warehouse on Keller Street was demolished. The land sold to developers who built condominiums where distribution centers once operated. The city moved on, as cities do. The story of the pregnant detective who took down a drug lord faded from headlines, replaced by newer dramas and different heroes. But Sarah's story, the real story, not the one the media told, was just beginning. It was a story about a woman who'd worn many faces, carried invisible badges, and lived through impossible situations. And in the end, she'd found the courage to set down the burden of those identities and simply be herself. A mother, a survivor, a woman who'd looked death in the face and chosen life instead. 3 years later, on a sunny afternoon in April, Sarah stood in her backyard watching her son play in the sandbox. He was building castles, his concentration absolute as he patted wet sand into a bucket and turned it over carefully. When the castle held, he looked up at her with such joy that her heart felt too full for her chest. Look, Mama, I made it. You did, she agreed, kneeling beside him. It's perfect. He went back to building, and Sarah sat in the grass, content to watch. Her phone buzzed with a text from Webb. They still kept in touch, meeting for coffee every few months. The message was simple: thinking of you. Hope you're happy. She typed back, I am happier than I ever thought possible. It was true. The life she'd built in the aftermath of that terrible night wasn't the life she'd planned or expected, but it was real in a way that her years of undercover work had never been. No lies, no pretending, no hidden identities. Just the daily reality of being a mother, of building a home, of finding purpose in small moments rather than grand gestures. The Nightshade badge would always be part of her history. The woman who'd survived that night in the warehouse, who'd faced down criminals and made impossible choices, still existed inside her. But that woman had evolved into someone new. Someone who understood that courage wasn't just about confronting danger. It was also about choosing peace, about walking away when necessary, about building rather than destroying. As the afternoon sun painted the yard in golden light, and her son laughed at his growing city of sandcastles, Sarah felt a contentment she'd never experienced during her years on the force. This was her mission now. This small, ordinary life. This beautiful, uncomplicated moment. And she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The end of one story had become the beginning of another. And this time, when people looked at her, they didn't see an undercover detective or a wounded officer or a woman in labor. They just saw Sarah. Exactly who she was meant to be all along.